Yeah. Yes.
You can get here, so I do not have to.
Yeah. You're still gonna be.
Yeah. Sorry.
With like rushes you in.
I was going to drive the microphone at party.
Right. You might be part of this party.
Well, you know, the problem is since Fedora's a community, technically everybody needs to be up there in this room.
Sometimes we may have. Yeah.
Let's talk.
Okay. All right, everybody sit down, please. We're going to get going.
We're going to to sit up here while you're doing your slide.
I'll tell my lantern slide story though later.
Come on up, Evan. Good morning. Thank you for coming to the Fedora panel session. My name is Josh Boyer. I work in platform engineering, longtime Fedora community member.
Hey, pay attention to Josh.
We got claps from Ben, so I'm good now. Thank you for stoking my ego. So today's panel session, we're going to start off with a brief presentation from Matthew because he promised to have graphs and slides in his keynote talk this morning, and he didn't have them there, so we're going to do them here. And then we have several community members up here with us. We have Jim Perrin from CentOS. We have Dennis Gilmore. We have Brian Axelbeard, otherwise known as Bex, right? And we have Kevin Fenzi from Fedora Infrastructure. Now, here's the cool thing about this. Since Fedora is a community, if we get questions from something that we can't answer, we're going to pull somebody out of the audience to answer it. Okay? Sound good? All right.
Yeah, there's really nothing special about being on the stage here except for...
Except we're taller and we have a microphone.
Yeah, having the microphone, like that's what being Fedora project leader is all
right, I'm going to go sit down. You get going.
Okay. Yeah, charts and graphs. I don't actually know the difference between a chart and a graph, so I put both words up there. One might be a subset of the other, but I'm not sure which is which. Okay, so I think, has anybody not seen this drill before? Yeah, liar. Right. I put no dinosaurs in this, but I promised Smooch to show dinosaurs otherwise, so I will talk about the dinosaurs. We don't do intrusive tracking at all, so the numbers here are basically from public data sources or things that are basically public-like. This is not a public data source because it's IP addresses, which we want sanitized. So this is a sanitized version of it into a gigantic aggregate of lumps of things. And this is from our mirror network. So it's systems checking in, and we count IP addresses per day, and this is actually a moving average of that. So basically, it gives us a rough idea of systems that are getting updates to Fedora. And we still see that, like, going all the way back to Fedora 6, we still have a few machines, actually a couple thousand machines checking in every day to see if we've maybe put out a security update for Fedora 6 today. They're continually disappointed, but we still count them. And yeah, so basically the story is growth at the beginning, then some sad times, and then since Fedora 20 is the yellow one there, and then Fedora Next stuff took off there, and last few years we have been just having really a lot of growth.
Can you just have a round of applause for that green section?
Yeah, good job, green section. And I started, the green section started being like a big lump, so I decided, it's time for a new section here, so I made Fedora 27 be orange now. It was going to be, and this is the new modular section, but I guess it might end up getting lumped back into green, and we'll start over with orange next time. We'll see how that goes. I don't know, there are a little bit of like flattening plateaus there, which it's hard to tell. There's noise, so the overall trend still seems to be up. So awesome, good job, everybody. This is the breakdown by release of those last few ones. It gets very noisy if I include all of them on there. But Fedora 25 is our peak, and Fedora 26 didn't hit that. Kind of had the same problem, 24 and 23 there. Basically, the even numbered releases seem to get cut off by the odd number releases, which I don't know. I still feel like we could do a one release a year with a point release update kind of thing based on the way that pattern goes. but I don't know. I don't know if it really matters that much in the individual releases because we're doing, especially with the new update system, a very good job of getting people onto the new releases afterwards. And I don't have a chart for this, but something like 30% of the systems are already on Fedora 27, and another 20% are on Fedora 26. So half of all users are on a supported release. So that's okay. We could do better on that. And then a big chunk are still on Fedora 25. And I think Fedora 25 is going to be another one of those that lingers for a long time, just because whenever there's a really popular when it goes that way. But even the things that are lower here are much higher than they were in previous years. So again, it's round of applause kind of numbers. Yeah.
And of course, then the people are going to get the next release and do some really big.
Right. Kevin is pointing out that it's pretty obvious that the reason they don't go up higher is because they're just cut off by the new release coming in, and that's exactly what happens. So I feel like it might be that they're coming too fast, but that's how it is. The other thing, so this is, that blue line growth is impressive, although it looks flattened here on this axis because these are the connections for the Fedora Apple users here, which is astounding growth here. And so this is why I talk about like the impact we make by making Fedora packages available to this bigger universe of enterprise deployments is pretty huge and awesome. So that's another area where we have effect. Now, I don't think we should at all discount the blue line just because the red line is bigger, because the impact of the fast-moving thing is measured in a different way, or it does different things. But that's a pretty cool thing. And I just want to show this slide. This one is a moving average. So if you see the faint lines here, the gray, that's the non-moving average numbers, and the red's a moving average. So I called this out separately. This is actually just Apple 7. And I don't know if you saw this on Twitter, but I just want to repeat it because it's so awesome. That one day, can anybody guess what happened that day? Yeah, suddenly everybody was like, I'm not sure I have updates on my system. Let me make sure I check. And so those numbers, which are already high, like triple that day, which I think is an interesting baseline. So when we look at this red line, if everybody would check in on a single day on this, that would be much, much higher than it is. So that's one of the reasons dinosaurs, I say, don't pay attention to what this actual number is. You should never look at that and say, oh, there's whatever, 1.2 million Apple systems out there. It's not. But I still think we can get something from the relative numbers. That's interesting. It's a good thing our mirror system didn't melt down, yes. Okay, and then final chart here. This is an entirely different data source. This is from FedMessage, and this is basically contributor activity that is easily measured. So when there's a FedMessage that goes out that has a user account attached to it, I count it here, and that basically means dist-git check-ins, Bodhi feedback, wiki edits, and I added Pagure, can't say it still, Pagure, issues and something there. I need to break that out differently. But so this is basically, the blue line is just if there was a person's name that week, I count it. And on average, it's basically somewhere in the 300 to 400 range there. And it's very spiky up and down. The valleys here are Christmas, which is reliable every year. A lot of Red Hat employees, companies shut down, and but you can still see, like even during that, there's a lot of activity. So the solid areas here, these are people who have been active for at least 13 weeks out of the last 52 weeks. So somebody who not just active this week, but also has been active at least a quarter in the past year. And that gets you into the solid color here. So these are kind of like the people who are really invested and around all the time. And of those people, The red block is people who have been basically involved since the beginning of the data source here. And then the yellow is people who have been, who their name first appeared between 1 and 2 years from the point on that graph. So at that point, that person has been active for 1 to 2 years. And the green is somebody who's been active for less than a year at that point. So I think this could be better, but when I started doing this, I was a little bit worried that basically the red would creep up and eat the yellow and green, and we would all be old school contributors with nobody new. And we actually do have a fairly healthy chunk of people who are new contributors to the project, and especially the intermediate ones. But especially and it's hard to get trends, but the green line this last year has been smaller than it was the year before, and I definitely do not like that. I would like to see more new people who are active. And again, this is not just checked in once, but this is active and stayed around for a little while. I'd like to see that green line and the yellow line getting thicker. And so that's one of the things I'd like to focus on this year, is like how we can get new people involved and plugged in to the project. And that's the end of my charts and graphs. So there.
Okay, now that we know what Matthew wants, what do you guys want to talk about? Questions? If there are no questions and I have to make them up, I'm going to ask you guys. There we go. Laura has a question. All right. Hang on. Nope, I'm going to run over here. I'm going to do a Mike McGrath.
So everyone's favorite topic, 32-bit. There's been some recent activity in terms of trying to form a 32-bit SIG to try and keep it alive. What are your thoughts about how they're doing, and what do you think should be future metrics for success, or at what time we should call it quits?
I'm going to let somebody else answer that one. Yeah, so 32-bit x86. This is Laura Abbott, kernel developer for Fedora, who is also a leader in Fedora.
Okay, so for the record, I'm not the person to answer this question because I thought it should have died forever ago, but I'll let answer it.
All right. So for a long time, at least for probably the last 10 to 12 years, the biggest user of 32-bit x86 has been the LPC XO, which has not had an x86 new version of x86 we shipped them in like 8 years at this point, 7 years.
Yeah, I mean, there's still quite an active community that has recent Fedora releases for that. I believe there are around 2 million of the x86 XOs deployed.
So yeah,
they're more consumers than active contributors.
Right. They're definitely, yeah. So Peter was saying there's about 2 million active x86 XOs out there, but that world is more consumers, and they also don't use the Fedora kernel, they use their own kernel. So if we switched off the kernel and still built the things and made it available to them, they could still do what they wanted to do. There's some IoT use cases for 32-bit, which we could limit down. As far as the x86 SIG, from my point of view, they're not communicating very well. I'm not sure that what they're actually doing and where they are with their work. So I'd like to see the SIG have more frequent, or have status reports like, hey, we've worked on, we're aware of these 200 or whatever, just seeing what the contributions are and communicating about, hey, we're meeting. It could be we're not finding any issues, and so things are just kind of cruising along. I'm not opposed to keeping it longer, but if there's no one going to do the work, then it should probably...
I know we set up we asked them to come up with benchmarks for themselves. Did that... And then I stopped paying attention. So
I think that I stopped paying attention is the problem in general, right? So they're kind of in a hard place where, and I know Laura's asking this question probably because she's seeing this from the kernel side, where kernel bugs get reported from somebody actually running on a 32-bit computer, which, by the way, is not actually true most times. Most times it's a 64-bit computer that they're running a 32-bit OS on, which is crazy. But anyway, so we see these kernel bugs come in, and because I'm a masochist, I still get all of the Fedora kernel bug mail. And so I see them as well. And what happens is she sends them over to the SIG, and they sit there, right? So they have a nice backlog of things that they could be looking at. Some of them are probably common across x86. Some of them are probably specific to 32-bit. And that may be because of machine constraints or whatever the case may be. But what I haven't seen, and Laura, you can nod your head yes or no, is I haven't seen that backlog go down hardly at all. Yeah, okay, so she agrees. Now, it's a hard place to be because they want to bootstrap, they want to contribute. We don't actually make it super easy for them to do that because if you look at it from a expertise level and you're trying to do a 32-bit OS, you kind of have to be an expert in a lot of things. And so it's not a simple problem to solve.
Having done that with the kernel stuff from ARM32, I started by getting aboard because I was interested in ARM as a hack thing, and now I know more about the kernel and tool chains and like low-level distro stuff than I ever thought I ever wanted to do.
Right.
It's hard, and I mean, I was stupid enough that I don't have, family or much of a life that I could do basically at 12 hours a day if I wanted to. But holy crap, I don't.
Yeah. So part of it is, look, it does seem crazy to do that, but from benchmarks like the desktop team ran, like if you have less than 2 gigabytes of memory on your desktop system, 32-bit is a very clear performance win, even with the additional registers and whatever else. So it's hard. Like it would be nice to be able to do it, but on the other hand, if people aren't showing up to do that, like maybe Fedora is not the place for your older laptop. And
right. So back to Peter's point, and for the this is being recorded, right?
Yeah, possibly.
So Peter pointed out that he started doing 32-bit on ARM, and over time he's built that expertise. How long did that take you? How many years? 8 years, right? So
and
this
Peter
whole
is one of the doesn't sleep people, so
right.
That's 16 years in normal person years.
8 years, has no family or kids that he has to worry about, can hack on it for his day job, and we created this 32-bit SIG like 9 months ago, so 8 years versus 9 months, it's kind of unfair to say they're being unsuccessful because I don't think they've really even gotten started. Adam.
Just a quick note on that. Another possible option. So I'm going to interrupt this conversation very briefly, and I am horribly unqualified to talk about this, so just everybody understand that. Is there anyone in this room who actually is in the 32-bit SIG? It's not a scientific poll. This is not the entirety of the Fedora community, we hope. No, we know it isn't. But is there anyone here in the SIG? Because one of the things that I'm wondering is thinking about Fedora as a project, thinking about Fedora as a way that contributors come to help solve their problems, maybe one of the things that we can focus on is defining what we as a project can provide to a SIG like the 32-bit SIG, and then this way they understand kind of where those edges are, so that like they know, okay, we will compose your stuff, but we're not going to block on you, for example, and here's how you find out if it fell apart. And we will help you with your kernel, but we're not going to necessarily write those patches for you. Here's where you need to be going to do that. And I think they know most of that, but I'm hearing a lot of we're not actually communicating that. And a boundary, I think, creates that communication point and gives us a way to focus.
Okay, so because Peter and Adam weren't on the recording, a lot of words to say. Talking to humans is hard. Okay. Question. Let's move on to something other than 32-bit. Dan. Wait. You get to talk in the mic too.
Can I sing Thriller? Ain't gonna happen. Yesterday we had in the 5-minute sessions, the lightning talks, there was someone came up to talk about Python 3 versus Python 2, and that, I don't know, there was 57 million packages still written in Python 2, and then he brought up a few that look like they've been abandoned in Fedora. And has there been any effort to figure out what is abandoned and then get it out of Fedora so we don't have to worry about things like that?
It's a great question. Who has written code in Python on stage here? Dennis has. Okay. So my sarcastic answer is, can't we just put that in a Docker container somehow, Dan? And yeah.
From the Reliance perspective, we don't have any tooling to figure out, like, is this package a package that, like when we do the master rebuild, for instance, if you look in the change logs of a ton of packages, the last person to touch it over the last 4 or 5 years is either me or the rel end user that we switched to for doing mass rebuilds, and they look unmaintained, and for a lot of them they are, but that's because the software has not been updated, and we would probably need some kind of like AI to figure out, is the reason this package is not being maintained because there's been nothing upstream, the software's stable, it works, there's no security bugs, there's no reason for it to actually have anyone do any work on it, as opposed to, it's just been abandoned, somebody's gone to the effort that packaged it and then dumped it and ran. And we just really don't have any tooling for that, because it's a really, really hard problem to solve, because there's many reasons why something is not being touched.
We'll repeat it.
Right.
I'll talk really loud.
Yeah, we'll repeat it.
One of my favorite days of 6 months is couldn't we do something similar to that, where if there hasn't been a being updated package in 2 releases,
Or 6 years.
6 years, that the last person to do an update gets a message saying, hey, this package is about to disappear.
Yeah, so Dan's suggestion was every 6 months there's scripts that go in and close all the current bugs that are open against what's about to go end of life in Fedora, right? And so could we have some script that does something similar for packages that haven't been touched by a human other than Dennis for mass rebuilds in the last, however many years? I think that's a really good idea. I would also selfishly say that I really want to see that now. So let's try to figure that problem out, Matthew. That sounds like.
Part of the issue with that is you'll find there's actual core packages that are intimate to the distribution that are in exactly that state. And you go and
Right.
that and just
Yeah.
won't boot anymore.
Yeah, sometimes actually software is done and people just, it doesn't need to change, right? So it's a good question.
Peter says part of the problem of doing that is that we'll find out that some of the packages that nobody is paying attention to are essential. And I guess I would argue that the problem is that we don't know which ones those are. So it's better to know. Do we? List them. Go.
We do. So, like, I went and killed off eSound because there was literally one thing that depended on it, and I'm like, this can all be completely emulated through other packages, and it hasn't been maintained. And I got hate mail, like literal hate mail for doing it. So it's a 32-bit problem.
Yeah. So back to the original question, though. For the Python 2.3 case, at some point, Fedora is going to need to decide, we're going to remove Python 2 now, and anything that's not being ported is going to have to be removed at that point.
Stephen Tweedy.
Yeah, I mean, so Kevin's point was, you know, the KDE SIG has been making sure that KDE 3 applications can run KDE 4, KDE 5. So that's absolutely something that we can do. And I think one of the really hard questions we have as a distribution is just because we can do it, does that mean we should, right? Stephen has had his hand up, and the gentleman in the back in the orange shirt definitely wants to ask a question. So let's try to tie this off, Stephen.
Take it out, send an email, it's no longer building, and see if anybody will show up and fix that one. And if we have a group effort, identify those ones cover, or if somebody randomly community decides this is one of my favorites, like I know the best to work. It doesn't matter where the work comes from, as long as the work happens. And if the work doesn't happen, then you have no choice but to go. Otherwise, I'll never make progress.
So Stephen is pointing out the Alien 2 solution. The only way to be sure is to nuke them from the orbit. All right, next question.
So, question is anyone here concerned about the overall drop in use in RPM distributions as a whole? Not just Fedora, but it seems to affect Fedora a lot over probably about the last 7 or 8 years. Well, DistroWatch, if you want to look at them, but just talking, you could use that as an example. Sure. But it's an example. But if you look and just talk to developers, when I run into developers, I am, in my day job, I'm a solutions architect for Red Hat. So when I talk to my customers about what they're using at home, mostly the young folks, I hear Ubuntu, I hear Debian, I hear Mint, I hear all kinds of things. I don't hear OpenSUSE. I don't hear Fedora. I don't hear CentOS. I don't hear that at all. Is anyone concerned about this? Maybe I'm the only one.
I know I am. I guess the way I would phrase the question isn't so much around RPM versus Debs or whatever. It's about what those alternative distributions. Question is now answered. The microphone is done. Is it working? Okay. So rather than focus on RPM-based distributions, I think the question becomes, what are those distributions that aren't using RPM offering that we aren't, right? And that's a hard problem to solve. So Canonical has done an excellent job of marketing their distribution as something that developers really want to use. They make it really easy. They focused a lot on usability improvements across the OS. And Fedora hasn't done that because Fedora is not a company that's driving that kind of market, right?
Yeah, and I'll try not to be cynical, but I think we care about usability, and we've had a lot of usability improvements, but Canonical has done a much better job of appearing to be listening. And I don't mean appearing to be in a negative way, but when they say we're going to solve usability problems, they make a big deal about, okay, we're listening, let's get your usability feedback, let's do something about it, and that's a very visible effort, and we have never been able to have it like a visible effort about those same kind of things, even though we're doing the same kind of things about usability. And I think that in reality, even back at the peak of, Ubuntu is so usable and Fedora is difficult, if you would have taken both of those and put them in front of people and done a usability study, you would have found that both of them were very confusing and difficult to use in some ways, and very beautiful and wonderful in other ways. And they weren't necessarily the same things, but it's not like Ubuntu has ever really been a lot more easy to use than Fedora. They've just done a really good, much better job about talking about that to people, and that's a difficult thing to do, so good for them.
So one of the other things that I want to bring up with respect to that
is the life cycle that we touched on toward the end of the keynote this morning that Mike brought up. The reason I think that is important, I will purge the user-specific information from this story, but please understand this is a real event that has happened. Names have just been changed to protect the guilty. There is a web hoster that switched from an early version of CentOS over to Ubuntu when they started shifting toward OpenStack for how they were going to do their hosting platform. They ran it that way for roughly a year until they had to start applying the first series of lifecycle updates. I want to say there was something important like Shell Shock or something like that that came out that kind of forced them into an early update cycle. From that point, they hit stability issues. They were a free user. They were switched over to being a paid canonical user. They still were not able to solve their issues. After another 6 months of beating on it at that point, they finally scrapped their entire system. They went back to CentOS, and instead of going to OpenStack, they went with Overt on CentOS to run their web hosting shop for how they're doing it. The life cycle is not sexy. It is not something that attracts users, but it is vital. It is a critical component. However, one of the other things that you're seeing with a lot of the more modern applications and Docker and everything else is more of a developer focus. Traditionally, and I'm not saying in every case, developers don't care about a 10-year life cycle. They're going to spin a machine up. They're going to do what they need to do. They're going to test it. It's Vagrant. It's Docker. It's something along those lines. They're going to kill it. So that something that lasts for that initial month or two for whatever they're doing or however long that early development phase is matters. That's happening on Macs, that's happening on Canonical, that's something that we need to address. But the fundamental for the Red Hat family of distributions has been that long life cycle tail. That still matters, that's still important, but we will lose some users to that as that shift in the industry happens. How we address that is something that's kind of up in the air. I think that's something that we need to work on, but it's a fundamental shift.
I want to drive very briefly back to your original question about, specifically you said you asked them what they're running at home, and you were also talking theoretically. I presume that some of your customers are old enough to have children and what they were doing. I don't want to call anybody out. Everybody in the room, stop here and think, what was the content of your last documentation commit? What was the content of the last talk you gave? What was the content of the last blog post you wrote? Was it written from the perspective of, I read this cool thing about doing this on Ubuntu, and now I'm going to tell you how to do it on Fedora? Or was it, I want to help you solve a problem, and Fedora was the example? We have to give these other distributions a whole lot of credit. However they got to that point in the conversation, a lot of the conversation today is, I'm going to tell you how to do this cool thing with containers, with serverless, with whatever. And the examples are not, unfortunately, on enterprise Linux family distributions. And a lot of what we need to do is we need to focus on these key fundamentals of lifecycle, of what we want to do to be successful. But we also have to learn to engage with those folks on solving their actual problem. The new Fedora mission statement that we adopted is specifically around the idea of enabling developers to solve the problems of their communities. Kind of talks back to the 32-bit SIG group. How can we all move that conversation forward so that when you ask that question next year, they go, well, my kid moved to Fedora because the project at school led them to this startup idea and there was great content about how to do that successfully. And maybe a 19-year-old comprehended that if the hockey stick actually hits, they're really going to want to look at something with lifecycle.
Yeah.
And so I think actually we have a really nice solution that kind of is both in the ethos but also, you know, solve the difficulty problem kind of coming online. But I can't believe how much I think that has affected.
Yeah, so for the people watching, Langdon pointed out that a lot of the usability stuff was also around stuff that Fedora just doesn't truly want to support or hasn't supported traditionally, like binary drivers and proprietary software and stuff like that. Now, I do know that Christian and your desktop team has been working quite hard on making that a little bit easier, a little bit more acceptable to use in Fedora. And is your talk later today, or did you get okay? Okay, so later today, Christian Schaller will be giving a talk on Fedora desktop, and I don't know if you're going to touch on that specifically, but if people are interested. Yeah. So he's going to now, right? But if people are interested in that kind of thing, then you can show up to Christian's talk and hear all about the goodness that.
I really appreciate also what Langdon said about the Christian and the desktop team doing a good job of figuring out a way that works with the Fedora community in a way that feels like, okay, this is something that, even though we don't want to promote binary drivers at all, we recognize the reality and we can present it to people in a way that lets them make an informed choice.
Yeah,
without being difficult.
To add to that, I actually used to. Maybe, we'll see. So that's where I'm going, though. So believe it or not, I actually used to work for Christian in a way, and he came to me with this proposal and said, we want to make this easier because we think this will do this. And I told him no, which is kind of cool about Red Hat. You can tell your boss no, and he was like my second line manager at the time. And I didn't say it quite like that, but that's kind of the answer he got. And he took that feedback from one of his own employees, and he was like, okay, let's figure this out. Why can't we just do this, right? And so he's worked very, very hard with the council and with his team to make it acceptable to at least try to see whether or not this will be successful over the long run and how much it could hurt or not hurt Fedora. So I think I understand that there are definitely different viewpoints. I don't think we're at the point where we can make that call yet. Keep talking, Langdon.
Yeah, I hear you. So the other point I wanted to make too is that Ubuntu being focused on developers is easier than Fedora being focused on developers. And the reason is because Ubuntu is a lot more than just a distribution, right? There is a company with a high focus directly on that product. They decided as a company that developers or user experience or, kind of bringing in straight up users as a desktop distro was important to the company. So they focused their employees directly on that problem. Fedora takes upstream community projects that have their own goals, their own ethos, and aggregates them into a distro. So it's really, really difficult for Fedora to say, we want to focus on developers, and actually make that impact without, having going and seeding the upstream communities and doing it, through some black bag sort of operation, right? Because, Fedora really is much more of just a distro than it is really controlling the upstreams it distributes.
Right. And going to the conspiracy thing and GNOME and all of that, I said in my other thing, it's funny to read these things on Reddit and Slashdot about the Red Hat conspiracy for GNOME, because when you look at Red Hat's priorities for, if you look at what Red Hat's focused on, it's Kubernetes, OpenShift, containers, and there is no desktop agenda at Red Hat at all, which is very frustrating to the people who do a lot of good work on the desktop team. They spend a lot of time fighting for attention and resources. What's that?
Or use it.
You're right. So, I don't know where I was going with that. Just like the desktop team is really doing a lot that brings desktop focus, Red Hat resources to investing in desktop development that we wouldn't have without people championing it for Fedora.
Bring this topic home because we got to get on to something else.
I just want to say, first of all, Langdon, I absolutely agree. The tail of the proprietary graphic drivers is very long. It affects a lot more things than people realize. And also going back to what Matthew said, a lot of times, even though we don't think of the desktop as the primary use case for Fedora, obviously if you look at numbers, it isn't, but it seems to have a lot of effect. People will grab it because the desktop looks neat, try it, and then do other things with it. Even me, when I talk to professional customers and government agencies, I'm a Red Hat public sector guy, I still see they're trying to use RHEL as a desktop, Fedora as a desktop, CentOS as a desktop, inside large agencies, inside large enterprises. And it does have an effect when they have issues. It really does matter.
All right. Yeah, that's a good point. So Kevin pointed out that there is a spectrum of developers, right? And it's very hard for an OS or a distribution to meet them all. Next person that has a statement rather than a question has to do it Jeopardy style, okay? So you had a question.
So the last election cycle was pretty bumpy. We had some problems with communication and setting the schedule. So I just wanted to direct it to the council and also to the Fedora community in this room to try to look at what went wrong with this last election cycle and mostly where we can improve and do better for the next cycles, things that people think would be more engaging or what like priority target areas would be. And for context, if you weren't aware, we had some problems where we missed the election cycle and it was a very confusing process, I think, for a lot of the nominees and also for the community to keep up with when to vote and what was going on. So I just wanted to kind of open it up to see if people action items, things that we could try to do better.
Okay, so Kevin, structure guy talking about this. No, hang on. So Kevin has been on FESCo probably longer than anybody in the Fedora project at this point. So I think you have some insight on this. Do you want to share it? Sure. All right. See, I put him on the spot, but he hasn't talked yet, so.
That's true. Is this thing going to work? Yeah, maybe. Elections are difficult because, they come up every cycle and they seem like they're kind of the same thing. It seems like a kind of a rote process. And so you lose excitement that way, and a lot of the same people run. I think getting the process right is important because those reasons you mentioned. The last election cycle missed process and did some things that people were surprised by, requiring interviews when they didn't know that there were interviews and those sort of things. I think we definitely should try and get more of the community involved. I did not look at the voting numbers this last time, but they were low, I'm imagining, yeah.
It depends on which one it was. Some of them were higher and lower, but
yeah. Right. So yeah, I think we definitely need to think about some new ideas in this aspect. We have in the past, there has been discussion about what we elect for and what things we do. Right now we're electing for FESCo, we're electing for council, we're electing for Mindshare. But, there's been discussions, should we really have that many elections? Maybe we should just elect a council that appoints the other bodies or, have some other way of doing these things because elections are very trying on the community. If you do them every 6 months and they're the same people, then people get bored with it and don't feel like their vote counts, and then you get in this cycle. So I think, I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think there's a lot of things that we could do and we should maybe explore.
One thing I think is that, especially if all of the slates for candidates this time were everybody was great. So it was I looked at the FESCo slate and I was like, okay, yes, okay. So
elections because everyone up for elections is fine. I don't really care which
right. But it's hard to tell, did no one vote because everybody seemed fine, or did nobody vote because nobody cares, or did nobody vote for whatever other reasons? So, yeah, right, and so everybody's fine, so nobody cares. So maybe that's the process working. Maybe we should just select people at random from the slate.
I think we should do American Ninja Warrior style. Let's do that.
Some of you have advantages at that versus others of us.
Have you not seen the show American Ninja Warrior? Do you remember? Okay, do you remember American Gladiator way back in the day? Okay, too much America.
It's very America, though.
America.
It's kind of like those Japanese, you go do the crazy.
It's actually a Japanese show.
Yeah,
it is a Japanese show. Right. Yeah.
Japanese people are very good at American culture. That's the.
Yeah. So Randy's comment was if we aligned the terms so that we're not doing 2 votes a year, we're only doing 1 vote a year, that might help as well.
Which that's actually how we originally did things. We just did like everything at once, and I think there was a FESCo where almost everybody changed out, and so we're like, well, maybe for continuity's sake, we need to make it so that we do half and half, so that you don't, particularly if there's some long-running programs or projects that are being worked on, the people that are involved, not that they're likely to just run away as soon as their time are up and not going to help, but the people that are involved in driving it would suddenly all go away, and then the new FESCo is got to, in the case of FESCo, the new FESCo then has to figure out, well, what was the old FESCo thinking, feeling, doing, how was this progressing, what was the goal, and so just for the sake of continuity, it's like the U.S. Senate, they do a third at a time for that same reason.
I was just going to add two things kind of related to this. One option might be to look at moving the election points because it's right at a release. Like, we've got a lot of other things going on in our community, and people may get distracted at that moment. It may also give us an opportunity to change the length of terms if we're very careful so that we have fewer elections for half of the body. But we also need to be careful to make sure that people have the opportunity to do their time and walk away. We don't want people to feel obligated to continue to contribute in an area where they don't have time to focus and they're personally feeling very guilty and the community is not able to successfully move forward. The other thing that I would mention is, for those of you who aren't familiar with Mindshare, it's kind of a different body. It's similar to the council in that part of the membership is selected and part of the membership is elected. So maybe that also represents an opportunity for some of these groups where there'll be fewer positions that come up for election because there are more positions that are selected forward.
Maybe. Okay. Next question. Brendan. Brendan has a question. So, for those of you that don't know Brendan, he's kind of like the man behind the curtain sometimes. So I'm very scared right now.
We're just kind of running out of time, and I'm wondering, because we got a really awesome cross section here. Like, what are some of the things that each one of you kind of want to see happen in the next year? And sometimes it's hard for like individuals to just jump in and do their own thing, and it's a lot easier to support somebody else. So what are you doing this year where you could use somebody or several somebodies so they could just talk to you and make it happen?
In 1 minute each.
Okay, so it's a really good question because there's all kinds of things we could do. And I'm going to let Matthew talk about objectives in a second because he's really going to want to talk about objectives from the council's perspective.
Start at that end then.
So what I would like to see is I would like to see somebody solve the Python 2 problem, the desktop user problem, the elections problem, and the 32-bit problem. All of those need to go away, and then we'll be good.
Ambitious. Let's see. The coming year, I've got a whole bunch of stuff as far as infrastructure goes. There's just so many things, it's hard to even focus on some, but one that will probably resonate with a lot of people in this room, we're planning a infrastructure hackfest in a few months, and one of the things we're planning on working on, like one of the primary things we're planning on working on, is fixing up workflows, documentation, and scripting around all the packaging stuff and all the things that changed last year in a hurry that weren't, that don't have documentation, or that the scripting is bad, or people don't understand where they need to go to do things. We're hoping to clean up a lot of that stuff in a month or two. What other things? So many, my mind blanks.
So I would add to the list already just general documentation. I would like to see our documentation become more useful to the people who consume what we produce. We're going to be automating all of the production of the documentation in terms of without content. Exactly. The microphone doesn't even work. We need docs on the mic. I would also add that I would love to see us reduce onboarding friction. It's difficult to join some parts of our project because basically you need to go steep in thousands of pages of documentation, blog posts, media, attend meetings for 3 years, and then find a secret wiki page, and then maybe we'll let you do something. How can we make that super easy for somebody to show up, get excited, and make their first contribution? And lastly, I would love to see us reach out and talk to more audiences. How can we get to conferences where we're not just sitting here talking to ourselves, where we're actually talking to developers or users or system administrators, people who might be interested in all of the lots of things that we make, but who may not come to a DevConf?
For me, I'd like to see us work on improving communications, because we kind of suck at it, and which goes into everything that Brian just said, and making it easier for us to work on the things that interest us most. So like some of the tedious, repetitive things that we've got, just making that go away, make that happen automatically so that we can work on the things that interest us most and get more engaged with other parts of the ecosystem, so CentOS. And CentOS and Fedora do a lot of things the same. They've got different resources, different skills, they bring different things to the table than what Fedora does, and we should take advantage of the strengths rather than try to fight and be like, no, we have to have our little fiefdom and our little silo of things. So for me, that's what I'd like to see.
So building on that, I'm looking at some of the stuff that isn't necessarily the attractive aspect of the distribution. I want to focus on QA, and we're working with the Fedora folks now on the CentOS side to kind of unite some of the QA pieces, to unite CI, to unite the documentation structure. None of this is exciting. None of this is deeply passionate type stuff, but it's all critical. It all matters. And I want to try to look at where we can do additional stuff. And as we are looking at that, I want to get away from the mindset of saying no out of hand. The mailing list post the other day that came out, actually I believe it was yours, on unifying the Git tree. Can we actually have the C7 stuff or C6 stuff in Git on Fedora? Why isn't it? And everybody just dismissed that out of hand. And then it was you, and actually I think, all right, fine. Who came back and said, let's do this, or let's not rule this out immediately, let's discuss it. So that's the sort of conversation that needs to happen. You get the last 15 seconds.
Okay. I want to see the green line and the yellow thing become wide swaths in this graph, however we can do that. And also, that mindshare taking off, and right now Bex and I have been working on the docs site and the docs infrastructure and the docs, and I would like Bex to not do that anymore. So that means I would like everybody else to, basically. Or Beck can do his 1/1000th of it rather than 99% of it. So docs fad coming up, it's going to be awesome.
By the way, you need to work on your salesmanship, man, because these problems, you got to sell them. Like, they are fun and exciting and sexy. Don't tell people this stuff is boring, because then it's not going to get work done.
Plenty of time.